I'm going to be going over how to change all of the driveline fluids on your E70 X5M. This is going to be a little bit more complicated than the standard X5. A few things will be a little bit different, but we have all of our automatic transmission fluid over here, a filter for automatic transmission. We have all of our drain plugs and fill plugs. So the fill plugs are going to be your standard BMW replacement, but the drain plugs we're going to be replacing with magnetic ones. So that way any metallic flakes that are going to be floating around in our fluid in between changes will not be run through our gears and filters, but instead will be collected on the magnets. The automatic transmission pan actually has two magnets already in it. These are the replacements for it. Right here we have our fluid for our transfer case, which is going to be a straight 70 or 75 weight. This one is from Redline. Same thing for the rear differential. We're using 75/90 weight, which is going to be for our front and rear differential. We have a very precise amount of fluid that needs to go into the rear differential because there's 3 different compartments, which is why we have so many drain and fill plugs. And that's what this little fluid transfer pump is for, because it has all of these precise measurements and we can see exactly how much fluid we're putting back in. It's not like a normal differential where you're just filling it until you see some fluid leak out of the fill plug, which is what we're going to be doing for the front and for the transfer case. I only got 3 quarts of the 75W90 for the differentials. You could probably go ahead and get 4 just to be on the safe side. I've got an extra one that I think I've got in some storage, so I'll get to that if I need it. We're not going to be changing the engine oil today, but if we were, we would be using Liqui Moly's 5W40. But I'll show you where all of the drain plugs are for the engine oil, where the drain plug is, where the oil filter is, and we'd be filling that up with 8.5 liters of oil. We've got 7 liters of transmission fluid over here. All of this came from FCP Euro. They have a nice single-click kit for the transmission, which includes everything you'll need to service the transmission, including the seal for the mechatronic unit, which I will not be addressing today. I will do that at the next cycle. BMW claims this is a lifetime fluid for the transmission and for the differentials. I'm changing this now at 75,000 miles. I would have changed it a little bit earlier, but I just hadn't quite gotten around to it yet. At this point, I plan to change it every about 60,000 miles, just stay on top of it, and I will replace the mechatronic seal the next time I'm in there. I don't want to deal with it today. I added a few other things. We've got a BMW specific oil filter wrench. It's 16 sides and it's 86 millimeters across. I've also got a container over here from Blackstone Labs, which we would use to analyze the oil if we were actually changing it today. We also have a 14 millimeter hex socket here and an 8 millimeter hex socket, and we're going to use those to take out our drain plug, one for the transmission and the other one's for the differentials. The reason I've got the 14 millimeter Allen wrench here is I may need to cut a piece off of that because it's a little bit tight in places, and getting this big socket and a wrench into there may not be possible. So cutting off a piece of this little Allen wrench right here and then using that maybe 1-inch section and a 14 millimeter wrench, we should have plenty of room to access it that way. With that said, that does mean we might not be able to torque some of these things down to the exact spec if we don't have room. So just make sure you do not over tighten these. You don't want to make this super difficult for you to undo this in the future. One thing you want to make sure of any time you're changing a fluid is make sure you have the ability to put that fluid back once you drain it out. So make sure you are breaking loose your fill plug before your drain plug. So my wife is currently out driving her car, so as soon as she gets home, I'm going to have her back it up onto ramps so we have plenty of access. But we want to do it now while the fluids are warm because it'll help them drain out a little bit easier, especially the differential and transfer case fluids. Those are pretty thick fluids, so having them warm will really help drain all that out. So looking from the middle of the car towards the front, if you look over here on what would be the passenger side in the United States, you have the oil filter. So this is where your oil filter is housed, and you'll just use that special adapter. It'll slip right over it and make it extremely easy to undo this and then tighten this back up properly without damaging it. And as we move towards the middle of the car, we have our oil drain plug right here. So next time I replace this, I will be using a magnetic plug. I didn't have one the last time that I changed the oil. I believe it is an M18 if I got mine from ECS Tuning. Changing the oil in the X5M isn't anything special. All you're going to do is undo this bolt right here. I believe you need a 7 millimeter hex key. You'll undo this, drain all the oil out, and then of course come over here and remove your filter, making sure that you don't make too much of a mess. Once all the oil is drained up, you'll replace this plug and you will put in your new filter, making sure to add oil to the housing to completely saturate the filter as much as you possibly can to avoid a dry startup. While the oil is draining midstream, you want to use that Blackstone lab container to catch yourself a little bit of oil so you can send that off for a sample. And then you'll fill it back with 8.5 quarts of oil. You can then check your level from inside the cabin using the electronic dipstick. For the first fluid I'll change today, we're going to do the transfer case, just because everything is very accessible. You've got your fill plug here, and on the back side we've got our drain plug. We have a decent amount of room to get the fill plug out. The drain plug feels like it's going to be a little bit tight, so we'll probably have to use that special tool that I made by cutting off the Allen key, but I'll show you that as I use that. So go ahead and break these loose, drain everything out, and as you can see, there's not a whole lot of height here, so we're really not going to need a whole lot of fluid. We'll just pump it in as much as we need, but we shouldn't need anywhere near a full quart. So I have my ECS Tuning magnetic drain plug in place here. This uses a 17mm hex, just a regular socket to screw it back in. I do not have clearance to get my torque wrench in here, so I just tightened it down until it felt nice and tight. And of course, I'm also using a brand new copper crush washer to make sure we don't have any leaks. And now, using a small transfer pump, we're going to pump our fluid into the transfer case until it starts to drain out of our fill plug. And then we can replace it with a new plug, a non-magnetic one, and we will be done for the transfer case and we can move on to the front differential. So we are currently sitting under the driver's side wheel. This little opening here in the skid plate, this is where you're going to drain your fluid out of. It's pretty straightforward. The plug is just right here. You can reach out and touch it. Very easy to get to. The fill plug is a little bit more difficult. There was a plastic tray right here, but it was held in place with some rivets and some very small screws. I believe they were 7mm hex heads. And if I pan up here, hopefully you can see this. Get my arm out of the way. So if you look up and you follow the axle in, right there is your fill plug. So it is just behind the axle on the driver's side, perfectly in line with the axle. And I believe this is the best way to get in there and access it. You can remove the aluminum brace down at the bottom. It requires 6 16mm bolts to be removed. The problem is those are torqued to yield, and I don't want to pay to replace them. I also don't want to mess with that plate if I don't have to. So removing the wheel while the car is jacked up anyway, and simply following the driver's side axle straight into the differential, and there is your plug. There's plenty of room to get some extensions in here and get to that fill plug, so not too big of a deal. So we're going to go ahead and break that loose. This differential will be a little bit more normal. What we're going to do is simply just fill it until a little bit of fluid drains out of the hole, just like the transfer case, and then we'll be good to go. So just to give one more angle while we're under here, this lower little panel right here, right next to the lower control arm, that is what you're going to have to remove. You do not have to remove the main cover under the front of the engine or the structural aluminum panel. All you have to do is remove this little panel right here, follow the driver's side axle straight into the differential, and you should see your plug. And you will use less than 1 liter of fluid in the front differential, same way you did in the transfer case, somewhere around 3/4 of a liter. But you're just going to fill it until it drains out of the fill hole, tighten everything up, and you are good to go. And now we can move on to the back. So with the rear differential, things get a little bit more complicated. So as you can see pretty clearly, we have 1, 2, and 3 drain plugs. Pretty easy to get to, a lot of access, not a big deal. The fill plug for the driver's side is up here, and mirrored on the passenger side, just behind this exhaust pipe over here, is the passenger side one. It's pretty similar. Not horrible to get to as far as you can see it really well. You're just going to have to be a little creative with how you get there. As I figure it out, I'll let you guys know. And then here is the fill plug for the middle. Now, these have 3 different fill capacities. On the driver's side, it's 540 milliliters, passenger side is 580, and the middle is 950, which comes out to just over 2 liters. So the little extra we have left over from the front, we can use that back here as well. So if you're doing the front and rear differentials at the same time, which I feel like you always should be, you should be fine using just 3. I don't think I'm going to need that 4th one, so I can just keep that for later. So I'll let you know how difficult it is to get these two side fill plugs open, and we'll go from there. Well, the rear differential is done. It wasn't as bad as I was expecting. Of course, these drain plugs were super easy to get to, and the center fill plug was super easy to get to. The driver and passenger side fill plugs weren't too bad. You are able to undo them at a straight shot with an extension coming in from the side. You can get it in between a little gap in the control arm. To get them back in, you are going to have to thread them in by hand to get them started, because the angle that you can come in is a little bit of a steeper angle, so you can get the plug undone that way, but it's a little bit difficult to thread it in that way with the extension, so you have to snake your hand in there and get it started gently with your fingers, and then you can reach the extension in and tighten everything down. So it's not too bad, it's just a little finicky, especially if your hands are bigger. For the passenger and driver side, the designated amount of 580 and 540 did fill it up to the point where it was draining out of the fill hole just a little bit. The center section, the 950 milliliters, did not. I was really tempted to go ahead and fill it until it started to drain out, but I trusted the manual, and I'm just going with the 950, and we'll see how that works out. That's what I'm told to do, so I'm going to do it. So we now have the front and rear differential and the transfer case done. We will move on to the automatic transmission in just a second, but we'll do a summary up on the bench of everything we've done so far, just any sort of special things that we've had to do along the way, and then we will get to the transmission. So before we move on to the automatic transmission service, we're going to do a little recap of the differentials and the transfer case. Using this transfer pump is so much more efficient than using this older style that just screws onto the top of the lid. I've been using this for years, and it's been fine if I'm doing one differential at a time, but if you're doing this job, just go ahead and use this big one, because you're going to be able to move half a liter of fluid at a time, and it's going to be so much faster and easier than sitting here and using this pump, one pump at a time, for like 20 minutes. This is just so much faster. For the Allen key, as you can see, we have cut quite a bit off of it. A 1-inch section and a 2.5-inch section is really going to be helpful. So just go ahead, buy a 14mm Allen wrench. It was like $5 to order it offline, and it was a lifesaver, because you don't always have room to use this big socket, especially if it's a 1/2-inch drive like this one. I have to use an adapter to get down to a normal size wrench. Really not a whole lot of room most of these places. So this longer section was really useful for getting to the fill plug for the front differential, and the shorter one was really good in tight places. So go ahead, order that. You're going to really thank yourself later. But as we move on to the automatic transmission, you're going to need a 5mm hex bolt, an 8mm hex socket, and a T40 Torx. I've got all the replacement bolts for the pan. I'm not sure if it's necessary, but we're going to go ahead and replace them while they're in there. These get torqued down to 7.5 foot-pounds, which is the same I'm going to do for both of the plugs, just because I've got good access to everything. We have our replacement magnets here. We've got a replacement gasket we're going to be using. This comes with a fiber gasket, like a green fiber gasket, but the X5M is supposed to be using a metal gasket, so I had to order that separately. So you guys will see that when we go ahead and put the pan back on. You're also going to need some sort of way of measuring the temperature of the transmission when you go through and do the second fill. You want it somewhere between 30 and 50 degrees Celsius, which is about 90 degrees to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. So you're going to need to get it up a little bit to operating temperature. We'll cover that a little bit later, but I think just an IR thermometer is the easiest way to do that. You just shoot a laser at the pan, and it'll tell you the temperature. You can, of course, use a computer and go in and use IMPA to do that, but this takes just a couple seconds. No extra hardware, it's super easy. So we have 7 total liters of fluid here. I'm only expecting to use about 5 of these because I am not dropping the valve body down and doing all that service. I don't think that's necessary at this point. So we will use a larger amount next time, but I'm only expecting to use about 5.5 liters of fluid for this specific service, because all we're doing is replacing the filter. So we're going to drop the pan, but we're not touching the mechatronics unit, we're not touching the valve body or anything like that. So here we are in the rear passenger corner of the automatic transmission in the X5M. You can see right here we've got our drain bolt and we've got our fill plug up here. And then all the way around the perimeter we have these T40 Torx bolts going all the way around. This is an aluminum finned pan, unlike the regular X5, which has a plastic pan. So we should get a very accurate temperature when using our IR gun to test this, see what temperature we're at later on when we're doing our final fill. So what we're going to do first, of course, is break loose our fill bolt, make sure that is good and out of the way. We've got a little aluminum pan down here we're going to have to move out of the way to get to some of these bolts. We'll drain everything out of our drain plug right here, and then we will work our bolts from the back towards the front, because we want, as this to break loose, we want the pan to come down and drain extra fluid out that the drain plug did not get. It'll also come out the drain plug as this starts to tilt more and more, so we'll want to have our catch basin underneath this to catch any extra fluid as it comes out. Once it's fully drained, we can replace our filter, which I'll show you guys how to do that. At this point, some people would go further and do, like I said, the valve body, mechatronics unit, all sorts of different extra seals in there. I think they're fine at this point. This car is not that old. We will hit all that the next time. This time, all we're gonna do is replace that filter, pop everything back in place, and then do a fill. You wanna make sure the car is as level as you can get it, just so you get an accurate fill level. Once we get our initial fill done, we will start the car, bring it up to temperature, maybe even drive it, depending on if we can get the transmission to play ball or not. Sometimes it will shift gears with it raised in the air, sometimes it will not. But we'll let it shift through the gears a little bit, going into drive, first, second, third, and reverse, leaving it there for about 10 seconds a piece. And once we get all of the fluid into the valve body and everything back to where it should be, we can then do our final fill. So I'm going to go ahead and get started draining, and then I will come back to you guys once I'm ready to replace the filter. So we've got the pan down, which was actually pretty easy. Just take every bolt off, starting from the back and working your way to the front. Once you get to the very last one, loosen it about halfway, and the pan should just angle down. And if you got the drain hole still open, it should just drain all the extra fluid out. It's pretty easy. There was only a tiny bit of fluid left in the pan when I completely removed it. Because the pan is a pretty heavy aluminum pan, unlike the plastic one on the regular X5, just make sure you support it a little bit. You don't want all the weight on that one bolt down there, because it could cause some problems with the threads. It is a pretty heavy pan. Getting the old filter out was pretty easy. Just grab it with two hands and pull straight down. However, make sure that this little seal that is on the stem of the filter comes out. On mine, it was left up in there, and I had to pry it out. It wasn't too difficult, just a very small pry tool and being careful not to gall the aluminum. But just make sure it comes out so when your new one goes in, it goes in pretty easy. Mine, I had no issues. It just popped right in. Make sure you lubricate this seal just a little bit with some new transmission fluid, and it slipped in with no problem. So next, what I'm going to do is put the pan back in place. We've got our new gasket sitting up here, so we've got everything ready to go. We've got our new drain plug tightened in. I just did it to hand tight. It's got a gasket on it. I don't think it needs to be very tight. It's going into aluminum. I don't want to over torque things. So we're going to put the pan back in place, torque everything down to 7 foot-pounds for these T40 Torx bolts, and then we can start the filling procedure. So I'm sorry I didn't film this, but there is a lot going on with the automatic transmission once you have to fill it up. So I'm going to run through exactly what you're supposed to do with this badass ZF that we've got down here to make sure that everything is properly filled. So step one, with it level as you can possibly get it, you're going to fill it up until it starts running out of the fill plug. Then you're going to close the fill plug back up. You're going to start the car, and you're going to put it in as many gears as you possibly can. Now, some people have reported that they were able to get up to third gear with the car on jack stands. My car was able to do that, but it did get cranky. It figured out that it was in the air and something was wrong, even with the traction control turned off. So it got cranky with me, but it was fine. It went away once I turned the car off and turned it back on. You want to put it into drive, leave it there for 10 seconds. Put it into sport, leave it there for 10 seconds. First, 10 seconds. Second gear for 10 seconds. Third gear for 10 seconds. Back to neutral, leave it there for 10 seconds. Go into reverse for 10 seconds. Make sure you're getting fluid through as much of the valve body as you possibly can. Then what you want to do is let the car run using your thermometer, checking the pan. You want it between, like I said, 90 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit, somewhere in that range, and you'll be good to go. I went a little bit towards the hotter side. I wanted it at about 115 degrees. Once I got it to 115, with the engine still running, do not stop the car. Engine's still running, so the transmission is still pumping fluid. You want to open your fill plug once again and put fluid back in until it runs out of a drain hole. Close it up, and then you should be done. So there's a lot going on here because the exhaust is right there. The exhaust is getting pretty hot by this point, so you got to be careful. And of course, once it starts spilling out, you're making a mess. You got to fill it up. So you got to be pretty quick with all of this. In the end, you should be putting somewhere around 5 quarts back in. All you did was drain, take the pan off, change the filter out, change the gasket, and put the pan back on. Now you'll put more fluid in the more of the transmission that you took apart. So if you took down the mechatronics unit and took the valve body down, you're of course going to lose more fluids. So you need to put more back in. So if you only put in around 4.5 fluids from a drain and refill, it's not that big of a deal. Just make sure that you follow that procedure, you get it up to temperature, you keep the engine running, and you keep it level, and you'll get the right amount in. Once you go back out and drive the car should drive normally. You should be able to put it in gear. You should be able to go back and forth from reverse and drive, and it should smoothly shift between the two. You should be able to go full throttle and blast through the shifts and not have any sort of weird revving of the engine, where the engine revs up but the car doesn't move forward. That means the transmission is slipping, and you don't want that. And that is how you service the entire drivetrain on your E70 X5M. So we changed the engine oil, we changed the automatic transmission fluid, the transfer case, the front diff, and the rear diff. It was definitely a lot of effort, especially that rear diff with its 3 different sections, added a lot of complexity to it. And of course the automatic transmission is a lot more complex to fill than something as simple as a manual. But we've got everything serviced, so the entire drivetrain should be good for the next 60,000 miles, and of course the engine should be good for the next 5,000 miles. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but torque spec for pretty much any drain or fill plug, the larger ones, BMW recommends 33 foot-pounds, which seemed a little high to me, especially because the ones we replaced it with were made out of aluminum, so I torqued them down to 20 foot-pounds. That should be more than enough to prevent any sort of a leak. For the very small one coming out of a transmission, I just torqued that one down hand tight. It's got a gasket on it, so I'm not too worried about it leaking. You just don't want to over torque these things because A, the next time you take it off it's going to be very difficult, and B, you might strip the threads, which would really ruin your day. So of course, if you guys have any questions about this process, please feel free to leave those down below. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys next week.